Good evening, guys. Hey, we're going to be in chapter 8 tonight. And remember, I said we want to connect 7 to 8 with that last miracle. And what I want to pull from that last miracle is Jesus, his method or his mode of healing the man, and also what he healed. He healed hearing. So keep that in mind as we go through here. Let me divide this chapter out for us. And we're going to continue. What we have been doing is kind of putting a title on each section, and then working from that. The first section here is verses 1 through 10, where Jesus heals the 4,000. Then we have a small section, verses 11, 12, and 13. Where Jesus deals with the Pharisees in a straightforward question, more or less an attack. A third section are verses 15 to 21. And then we have 22 to 26. And then we have, I'm going to just lump it all together, 27 all the way to the end of the chapter. So let's break these down one at a time. The feeding of the 4,000, 1 through 10. Now, I don't want to go through this in all the details because so many of the details reflect the same as the feeding of the 5,000. You have a lot of the same elements. What I do want to do is I want to develop some questions from the text that would be questions to the church today. The disciples who will be the seeds for the church, they learn some real strong lessons here, and so get your piece of paper and pen ready, and I want to list several questions that I think we need to ask ourselves when it comes to this passage. And so I'll just ask the question and then show you in the text where I got it. The first question is, where are our God-sized dreams? Where are our God-sized dreams? Now, Jesus says, hey, we need to feed these people. And once again, the disciples fail to make connections between Jesus and his ability. And so they don't see the possibility there. Let us guard in our own ministries the temptation to leave Jesus out of the equation. Jesus plus nothing equals everything. And Jesus had compassion on them in verse 2. The disciples didn't. Or even if they did have compassion, the compassion was limited because of their low view of Christ, their limited view of Christ. And so where are our God-sized dreams? What kind of dreams do you have in ministry? What kind of dreams are you looking toward? What do you, if you could have it the way that you feel God has put in your heart, what would that look like? What moved Jesus didn't move the disciples. And so what Jesus is amazed about is here are people who have followed Jesus for 3 days. Don't miss that in verse 2. They had followed him for 3 days and had nothing to eat. Wow. We can't get people to listen and sit still for an hour without being hungry for lunch. 3 days. They are following him without food. And what does that say about them? The reason I believe the 4,000 received the great miracle is because of their great devotion. They're following Christ at a sacrifice. Where are our great needs? The disciples had lost their focus on Christ. They'd forgot the lessons they had learned earlier. Number 2, here's a second question I want us to ask ourselves. Has the unchurched become an inconvenience to us? has the unchurched become an inconvenience? That's strong language. Because Jesus has compassion and he says, I can't send them away. We need to feed them now, in verse 3. And in verse 4, the disciples' response, very similar to before, where will anyone be able to find enough bread? We can't. We can't find enough bread to satisfy them. Jesus, you just need to send them on because we can't do anything. The people had become an inconvenience. They were ready for them just to go on home. Just send them on home. Can I give you a test to take real quick? Here's some signs that people have become an inconvenience to us in regards to a church. Okay? One test, one sign is this. We don't want to spend our money on them. When I don't want to spend my money on ministry to the people, they've become an inconvenience to me. And this is where the disciples were. Here's another question. When we weigh the return on our investment, when we say, man, why spend all this money for one meal? You see how you weigh in return on investment? When I start to do that, then people have become an inconvenience to me, or they've become a property to me. When we're afraid they'll come, I've heard this, unfortunately, in people that, hey, we don't want to reach out to them because they might come here. God help us if that's ever our heart. A third question that I want to ask, not only where's our dream, not only have they become an inconvenience, but a third question is, have we grown cold with our familiarity with Christ? Have we grown cold with our familiarity with Christ? Now, the church at Ephesus was praised because they had just this great fervor for God, but in Revelation, Jesus scolds them because they have left their first love. But when you look at what he commends them for, they're doing a lot of great ministry. But you see, it's possible to do great ministry without a great love for Christ. And the 12 have been with Jesus for a couple of years now. They've had some of the most concentrated time with Christ that anybody else has had. But Jesus is still going to say to them in a little bit, have I been with you this long and you still don't understand? Even when we're looking in chapter 7, in verse 18, he says, are you so lacking in understanding? And in each chapter, there's a comment like that the disciples, they're familiar with him. And in that familiarity, they're just growing cold. So have I become so familiar with Christ that I've lost that zeal and that passion for Christ? I do ministry, but it's not with a zealous heart. Here's a fourth question. How will we serve the goodness of Christ to those around us? Now, these guys had a great need right before them. They had 4,000 people right there. They had a great need. And the question that they needed to ask, that we need to ask is, how do we serve God's goodness to those people who are around me? And I need to be having that conversation often as a church leader. How can we most effectively serve our community? How can we most effectively pour out to them the beautiful gospel? Two more questions. Are we seeing or are we witnessing the great works of God in our churches? 4,000 people were fed and satisfied. Are we seeing stuff like that happen? If we're not, why not? The last, is it because we've quenched the spirit? Is it because we have unbelief? Is it because we want to choose the comfortable path? I don't know, but why aren't we? And that is a question that we church leaders need to keep asking and keep asking and keep asking ourselves. Lord, I want to see your spirit poured out. Isaiah says, rend the heavens and come down. God, please do that. Here's the last thing. what will I take away from this story? Each of the disciples, it says there was 7 baskets of food left over. They're taking stuff home. The feeding of the 5,000, they have 12 baskets. People are taking things home. What are you going to take home from this passage? What does this passage reveal to me about what I need to do? Okay? Some good things there. Let's go to verse 11, the second grouping. So we see here Jesus takes a need and he teaches from it. Verses 11, 12, and 13, we see Jesus dealing with conflict. And so that would be my title for these 3 verses. How did Jesus deal with conflict? I think he has 4 or 5 responses. Notice it says that they came with a question and they are wanting to see a sign from heaven. But we see their motivation because it says they argued with him in verse 11 and they came to test him in verse 11. So we see their motivation in asking their question. And if we can see that, then Jesus sees that most definitely. And so once again, he goes back to the heart. They come with a physical question. He goes to the heart of the matter. And notice that his response begins with that deep sigh that we said was in verse 34 of chapter 7. So here they ask him a question, give us a sign from heaven. He has a deep sigh, and he doesn't really address them. He just kind of speaks in third person. He says, why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. So he speaks in third person, and then he addresses them specifically. He says, I say to you. And then he leaves. How did Jesus deal with this conflict? This is conflict here. How does he deal with it? Here's 4 or 5 things. Number 1, he deals with it in self-control. Self-control. He doesn't lash out. He just is, this sigh from deep within. He's under control. When we face conflict, we need to remain under control. Here's the second thing that he does. There's stability. He's under control and he's stable. You don't see him losing his calmness. You don't see him getting off his game. You don't see him losing his focus. He's stable in his response. His response comes with a pause. There's this deep sigh. He looks up to heaven. He doesn't just blurt out something. Here's a third thing. He answers in a simplified way. And really, he doesn't give an answer. He just states why he's not. Did you realize that I don't have to respond to every criticism? I don't have to respond to all conflict. I need to deal with it. But my dealing with it doesn't have to envelop all of my time. Notice in this chapter, he only lets it take up 3 verses. He does not continue the discussion. He nips it and he moves on. Very simplified answer. And when we deal with conflict, it needs to come in much the same way. We need to speak in terms of Scripture and move on. In his temptation, when he faced conflict with Satan in the temptation, how did he respond? He just responded to Scripture and he stopped. Simplified. The fewer words I say, the better off I am. Here's something else Jesus did. He separated himself. He removed himself from the conflict. And I think that